Hello and welcome to the Sleep Room YouTube channel. Tonight we have a story for you. Are you ready? Then let Rapunzel read this tale for us.
The Shadows of Elmer's Castle Chapter 1. The Guardian's Path. Deep in the misty plains of southern England, there stands a castle made of time itself. Castle Elmer rises from the earth like a gentle dream, its weathered stones kissed by centuries of morning dew. The mist rolls across the meadows, soft as lamb's wool, wrapping around the ancient walls with tender care. Here, where the river Itchen once carried Norman boats, where Saxon farmers once tilled the rich, dark soil, the castle keeps its quiet watch, and an old man walks these walls each evening. His footsteps soft on worn stone steps. His name is William, though the wind calls him many names. Guardian, ever, friend to the stones. William carries a brass lantern, its flame dancing like a firefly, casting gentle shadows that seem to breathe with the night. The lantern was made in the village of Alsford, where skilled metalworkers once hammered copper and tin, creating beautiful things that lasted for generations. William's boots are made of good English leather, soft from years of walking, comfortable as old friends each night. He begins his journey at the gatehouse, where ivy grows, thick and green, its leaves whispering secrets to the evening breeze. The gatehouse was built in the year 1215, when King John ruled England, when knights wore chainmail that clinked softly as they walked stone by stone. The castle was raised by master masons, men who understood how rocks could become art, how walls could become poetry. They used local chalk, pale and smooth, mixed with flint that sparkled like stars in daylight. The mortar was made from lime and sand with crushed oyster shells from the nearby coast, creating bonds that would last 1,000 years. William pauses at the first corner, running his weathered hand along the cool stone. "Good evening, old friends," he whispers, his voice gentle as summer rain. The stones seem to hum in response, a deep, quiet sound that only those who listen closely can hear. Tonight, like every night, William will walk the complete circuit, touching each tower, greeting each wall, sharing the day's small adventures with his silent companions. The eastern wall faces the meadows, where sheep once grazed on grass sweet with clover and wild thyme. Medieval shepherds knew that sheep were happiest when they could taste many different plants, so they moved their flocks to new pastures with the changing seasons. The wool from these sheep was famous throughout Europe, soft and strong, perfect for weaving into the finest cloth. Ladies in the castle once wore gowns made from this wool, dyed with madder root for deep reds, with woad for sky blue, with saffron for golden yellow. William stops to listen, and in the gentle evening breeze, he can almost hear the soft bleating of long ago sheep, the quiet conversations of shepherds, the distant sound of spinning wheels. The castle kitchen gardens once grew here, filled with herbs that perfumed the air. Rosemary for remembrance, growing in neat silver-green rows. Lavender for peace, its purple flowers beloved by bees that made honey sweet as liquid sunshine. Sage for wisdom, its soft leaves perfect for seasoning the roasted meats that graced medieval tables. Medieval cooks knew that food was medicine, that the right herbs could cure headaches, calm troubled stomachs, help weary souls find rest. They grew parsley for fresh breath, mint for digestion, chamomile for gentle sleep. In winter they dried these herbs in bundles, hanging them from the kitchen rafters, filling the warm rooms with summer's memories. William continues his walk, his lantern light dancing across the ancient walls. The south wall is the warmest, blessed by long hours of gentle sun. Here fruit trees once grew in careful rows, their branches trained against the stone walls, creating living tapestries of green leaves and sweet fruit. Apple trees bore fruit both tart and sweet, varieties with names like costard and court pen de plat, apples that could be stored through winter in cool cellars lined with straw. Pear trees grew alongside, their fruit perfect for making perry, a gentle drink that sparkled on the tongue. Medieval gardens were designed to please all the senses, not just the eyes. The gardeners planted sweet-smelling herbs between the fruit trees, creating paths that released perfume with every footstep. They built bee skeps from woven straw, providing homes for the busy workers who turned flower nectar into liquid gold. Honey was precious in medieval times, the only sweetener most people knew. Used to make mead that warmed winter evenings, to preserve fruits for the dark months ahead. William pauses at the chapel wall, where climbing roses once grew. White roses for purity, red roses for love, pink roses for gentle affection. The medieval mind saw meaning in everything. Colors had significance. Flowers carried messages. Even stones had stories to tell. The chapel itself was built in the Norman style, with round arches that seemed to embrace those who entered. Small windows let in just enough light, creating a sense of mystery and peace. The altar was made from a single piece of Purbeck marble, quarried from the isle of the same name, transported by boat and cart across the English countryside. Medieval stonemasons traveled great distances to find the perfect materials, understanding that some stones sang differently than others, that each type of rock had its own voice. The chapel bells were cast in bronze, an alloy of copper and tin that created sounds both deep and clear. Bell-making was a sacred art. The bronze heated in furnaces that glowed like captured sunsets, poured into molds carved with prayers and blessings. When the bells rang for evening prayers, their sound carried across the countryside, calling farmers in from their fields, reminding everyone that day's work was done. William climbs the spiral staircase of the North Tower, his footsteps echoing softly in the narrow space. These stairs were built clockwise, a defensive design that favored right-handed defenders, but tonight they serve only to lift an old man closer to the stars. To the top, the view stretches across the misty plains, where ancient field boundaries still mark the landscape like lines in a well-loved book. The medieval system of farming divided land into long, narrow strips, each family working several different strips to ensure fair shares of both good soil and poor. This open field system created a patchwork of different crops: barley for brewing ale, wheat for bread, oats for horses, and porridge. Between the planted fields lay fallow strips, resting land where sheep and cattle could graze, their manure preparing the soil for next year's crops. Medieval farmers understood that soil was alive, that it needed rest and nourishment to remain productive. They planted nitrogen-fixing legumes, peas and beans that drew goodness from the air and gave it to the earth. Crop rotation was an ancient wisdom, understanding that variety kept both soil and people healthy. William gazes out over this timeless landscape, where modern hedgerows follow medieval boundaries, where ancient wisdom still guides the rhythm of seasons. The wind carries scents across the plains, the green smell of growing grass, the earthy richness of freshly turned soil, the sweet perfume of distant orchards in bloom. Each scent tells a story, speaks of continuity, of human hands working in harmony with the natural world. William descends the tower steps, continuing his nightly circuit. The west wall faces the setting sun, where evening light paints the stones in shades of gold and rose. This was once the most private part of the castle, where the lord's family had their personal chambers. Solar chambers they were called, designed to catch every precious ray of sunlight. Windows here were larger, glazed with horn or oiled parchment that let in light while keeping out winter's chill. Glass was precious in medieval times, made by master craftsmen who guarded their secrets carefully. The finest glass came from Venice, clear as mountain streams. Transported across Europe at great expense, most castles made do with oiled cloth or thin scraped horn materials that created a soft, golden light perfect for reading or needlework. Medieval furniture was built to last generations. Heavy oak tables that could seat 20 chairs carved with the family's heraldic symbols. Beds were treasures, draped with curtains to keep out drafts, topped with mattresses stuffed with sweet-smelling herbs. The wealthy slept on feather beds, soft as clouds, warm as summer afternoons. Pillows were filled with down from geese raised in the castle courtyards, birds that also provided quills for writing, fat for cooking, and meat for feast days. Medieval households wasted nothing, understanding that abundance came from using everything well. Even goose grease had its uses: waterproofing boots, conditioning leather, soothing winter chapped skin. William completes his circuit at the Great Hall, where the castle's heart once beat strongest. Here the entire household gathered for meals. From the highest lord to the humblest servant, long tables filled the space, arranged according to careful social orders that everyone understood. The high tables sat on a raised platform, where the lord and his family dined on silver plates, drank from goblets made of pewter or precious metal. Lower tables accommodated the household staff, knights and ladies-in-waiting, pages learning the arts of courtesy. The bottom of the hall sat the servants, honored members of the household who made castle life possible. Medieval meals were communal celebrations, times for sharing news, telling stories, strengthening the bonds that held society together. Breakfast was simple: bread and ale, perhaps some cheese or cold meat left from the previous evening's feast. The main meal came at midday, elaborate affairs that could last for hours. Dinner began with washing hands, a ritual both practical and symbolic, performed with warm water poured from silver ewers into matching basins. Medieval cooks were artists, creating dishes that pleased the eye as much as the palate. Peacocks were roasted and refeathered, presented as if still alive. Swans graced the highest tables, symbols of purity and grace. But the most common meats were practical: beef and pork from animals raised in the castle's own fields, chicken and duck from the courtyard flocks, game from the surrounding forests. Venison was a special treat, deer hunted in the lord's private woods, prepared with reverence for the noble beasts that gave their lives. Medieval hunters followed strict codes, taking only what was needed, respecting the natural balance that kept forests healthy. Wild boar provided sport and sustenance, dangerous hunts that tested courage and skill, meat that tasted of forest floors and wild berries. Fish came from the castle's own ponds, carp and pike raised in artificial pools, tended like underwater gardens. On Fridays and during Lent, fish replaced meat on every table, a religious observance that connected daily meals to spiritual life. Salmon ran up the rivers in silver streams, netted by fishermen who knew exactly when and where to cast their nets. Herrings were caught in vast shoals, salted and stored in barrels for the winter months, providing protein when fresh food was scarce. William settles into his favorite chair, a simple wooden seat built into an alcove in the great hall wall. From here, he can see the entire space, imagine it filled with life and laughter. Hear the echoes of long ago conversations. His lantern casts gentle shadows on the walls, shadows that seem to dance with memories. The stones remember everything, every feast, every celebration, every quiet moment of daily life. Medieval evenings were times for entertainment, for strengthening the bonds that held communities together. Minstrels traveled from castle to castle, carrying news and stories, songs that turned history into melody. They played harps strung with gut, lutes with bodies carved from single pieces of wood, recorders that sang like wooden birds. The songs they sang were both old and new, ballads that carried ancient wisdom, news songs about recent events. Love songs spoke of courtly romance, idealized relationships where devotion was its own reward. Epic songs told of heroes and adventures, of knights who exemplified the highest virtues, of ladies whose beauty inspired great deeds. Sacred songs brought heaven into earthly halls, hymns in Latin that connected local communities to the universal church. Dancing was both recreation and ritual, elaborate court dances that displayed grace and refinement, country dances that celebrated the turning seasons. Medieval dance was a form of storytelling, movements that expressed emotions too deep for words. The pavane was slow and stately, perfect for displaying rich clothing and elegant manners. The galliard was lively and athletic, a chance for young people to show their vitality and skill. Country dances followed patterns as old as agriculture, circles that honored the sun, lines that imitated plowing, steps that celebrated planting and harvest. William closes his eyes, listening to the wind sing through the castle stones. Tonight, the air is different, charged with something he cannot quite name. The mist seems thicker, more purposeful, as if it carries messages from distant times. Chapter 2. Voices in the mist. The lantern flame flickers, casting new patterns on the ancient walls. William has walked these stones for 37 years, but tonight feels unlike any other. The wind carries sounds that might be voices, or might be merely the night speaking in its ancient tongue. He rises from his chair, moving slowly through the great hall, listening with all his senses. The acoustics of the hall are perfect, designed by builders who understood how sound travels through stone, how whispers can carry across vast spaces, how silence itself has weight and texture. Medieval builders were masters of many arts. They knew that castles were not just fortresses but living spaces where human voices needed to find their proper homes. The great hall's vaulted ceiling creates a natural amplifier. Every word spoken here gains resonance. Every song becomes richer. Every prayer more profound. William pauses at the center of the hall, where the hearth once blazed with fires that never died completely. Medieval fires were sacred things, tended by servants whose sole job was keeping the flames alive. The great hearth could roast entire oxen, warm the vast hall even in the deepest winter, provide light for reading and needlework during the short winter days. Firewood was gathered with ceremony. Different woods chosen for different purposes. Oak burned long and steady, perfect for overnight fires that needed to last until dawn. Applewood burned sweet, filling the hall with perfume that reminded everyone of summer orchards. Pine crackled and sparked, providing entertainment as well as warmth, its resin popping like tiny celebrations. The andirons that held the logs were works of art, cast iron shaped into heraldic beasts, dragons and lions that seemed to guard the flames. Bellows made from leather and wood kept the fires bright. Operated by pages who learned through this simple task the importance of steady service, medieval metalworkers created tools that were both functional and beautiful. Understanding that daily objects should please the eye as well as serve their purpose, fire tools were handed down through generations, their handles worn smooth by countless hands. Their metal surfaces polished to mirror brightness by decades of use. William kneels by the cold hearth, running his hands over stones still stained by centuries of smoke. These stones remember warmth, remember the countless meals prepared over these flames, the stories told by firelight, the faces illuminated by dancing shadows. Medieval cooking was an art of timing and temperature. Cooks who could judge heat by holding their hands above the coals, who knew exactly when meat was perfectly roasted by the sound of sizzling fat. Spits turned slowly over the fires, operated by turnspits, small dogs bred specifically for this purpose, running on wheels that turned the roasting meat. These dogs were cherished members of the household, fed the finest scraps, given warm places to sleep, honored for their essential service. Spit boys also turned the roasts, usually the youngest kitchen servants, learning the trade by starting with the simplest but most important tasks. They sang while they worked, timing songs that helped them maintain the proper speed, keeping the meat turning evenly, preventing burning on any side. Medieval kitchens were communities within communities, hierarchies based on skill and experience, led by master cooks whose knowledge was passed down through generations. Sauces were the cook's signature, complex mixtures of spices that cost more than gold, combinations that took years to perfect. Verjuice made from unripe grapes added tartness to rich meats. Cinnamon from distant Ceylon warmed winter stews. Ginger from the Indies brightened heavy porridges. Saffron from Spanish fields turned simple rice into golden luxury. These spices traveled thousands of miles, carried by merchants who risked their lives crossing deserts and mountains, traded in markets where a handful of peppercorns could buy a cow. Medieval spice trade connected the castle to the wider world, bringing flavors that spoke of distant lands, of cultures and climates beyond imagination. William stands, continuing his exploration of the changed castle tonight. The mist seems to have entered the hall itself, creating soft, pearl-like veils that drift between the columns. The columns are masterworks of carved stone, each one slightly different, decorated with leaves and flowers that seem to grow from the very rock. Medieval stonemasons were artists as well as craftsmen. They carved roses that seemed to bloom in stone, leaves so realistic they seemed to rustle in imaginary breezes. Each column tells a story, some decorated with biblical scenes, others with local plants and animals, a few with mysterious symbols whose meanings are lost to time. The capitals of the columns bloom with carved foliage, oak leaves for strength, ivy for fidelity, grapevines for abundance. These plant symbols were a language everyone understood, a way of communicating values and hopes through stone. Medieval people lived surrounded by symbols. Everything from the arrangement of furniture to the colors of clothing carried meaning. Red meant power and passion, blue represented heaven and faithfulness, green spoke of new life and hope, white symbolized purity and peace. Even the arrangement of flowers in the solar chambers carried messages. Roses and lilies together spoke of love that was both earthly and divine. The language of flowers was taught to young ladies as carefully as reading and writing, a way of communicating feelings that words could not express. William moves toward the stairs that lead to the solar chambers, his lantern casting long shadows that seem to beckon him upward. These stairs are different from the defensive spirals of the towers, wider and gentler, designed for ladies in long gowns. For servants carrying heavy trays, the stones here are worn smooth by countless feet, polished by centuries of passing hands that use the walls for support. Each step carries the memory of all who climbed before. Pages hurrying with messages, ladies ascending to their chambers, children running up and down in their games. Medieval children were small adults in many ways, but they were still children. They still laughed and played and dreamed. They played games that taught adult skills. Toy swords that prepared boys for knighthood. Dolls that helped girls learn mothering, board games that developed strategic thinking, knucklebones taught dexterity and timing. 9 Men's Morris developed tactical thinking. Chess was considered essential education for nobility, a game that mirrored the complexities of medieval society. The pieces themselves were works of art, carved from ivory or precious woods, each one a miniature sculpture. Kings and queens were dressed in flowing robes. Bishops wore their mitres. Knights rode charging horses. Even the humble pawns were carved with care. Medieval craftsmen understood that beauty was not a luxury but a necessity, that daily life should be enriched by objects that pleased the eye and touched the heart. William reaches the landing, where a series of chambers once housed the castle's most important residence. The Lord Solar was the largest, a private space where the family could retreat from the public demands of hall life. Windows here are tall and graceful, designed to let in maximum light while maintaining privacy. Window seats were built into the thick stone walls, perfect spots for reading, for needlework, for quiet conversation. Medieval women spent many hours at these windows, working on tapestries that could take years to complete, creating beauty that would warm and decorate their homes. Tapestry weaving was both art and storytelling. Scenes from romance and history worked in silk and wool, colors that glowed like jewels even in candlelight. The most famous tapestries came from Flanders, where weavers had perfected techniques passed down through generations, where guild secrets were guarded as carefully as state treasures. But every castle had its own needleworkers, ladies and servants who created hangings for beds and walls, cushions for hard wooden seats, altar cloths for the chapel. They embroidered with silk threads dyed in every color of the rainbow, gold thread that caught and reflected candlelight, silver thread that gleamed like moonbeams. The patterns they worked were both decorative and meaningful. Intertwined vines spoke of eternal life. Birds represented souls ascending to heaven. Flowers symbolized the virtues. William enters the ladies' chamber, where a great bed once stood draped in fabrics that rivaled royal robes. Medieval beds were rooms within rooms, enclosed by heavy curtains that provided both warmth and privacy. The curtains were made from the finest wool or silk, often embroidered with the family's coat of arms, lined with fur in the coldest months. Mattresses were precious possessions, stuffed with the finest materials available, goose down for the wealthy, wool for the middle ranks, straw for the servants. Over the mattresses lay sheets of fine linen, woven from flax grown in nearby fields, bleached white by repeated washing and sun-drying. Medieval laundresses were skilled craftswomen. They knew which herbs would whiten fabrics, how to remove stains without damaging delicate fibers. When water was perfect for washing, they used soap made from animal fat and ash. Harsh by modern standards but effective at removing the dirt and grime of daily life, washing was done in great wooden tubs, water heated over fires, stirred with wooden paddles, wrung out by hand. The cleanest linens were saved for special occasions, feast days when the family would display their wealth through the quality of their household goods. Blankets were woven from the finest wool, sometimes mixed with silk for extra softness, dyed in deep, rich colors that spoke of luxury and comfort. Coverlets were often works of art, quilted in intricate patterns, embroidered with scenes from family history, decorated with pearls and precious metals. William sits on the stone window seat, looking out over the misty landscape. From this height, he can see the entire estate, fields that once fed hundreds of people, forests that provided timber and game streams that powered mills and filled fish ponds. Medieval estates were designed to be self-sufficient. Everything needed for daily life produced within a day's walk of the castle walls. The home farm provided grains and vegetables, meat and dairy products, eggs and poultry for the table. Orchards produced fruit both fresh and dried, apples and pears that could be stored through winter, nuts that provided oil and protein. Mills ground grain into flour, their great stones turned by water power, producing the bread that was the foundation of every meal. The miller was an essential member of the community, his skills ensuring that grain became food. His honesty crucial since he was paid with a portion of every grinding. Medieval mills were marvels of engineering, water wheels that captured the power of flowing streams, gear systems that transferred that power to massive grinding stones. The stones themselves were chosen carefully, imported from regions known for the perfect texture, neither too soft nor too hard, able to grind grain without crushing it to dust. Millstones were dressed regularly, carved with grooves that helped move the grain from center to edge. maintained by craftsmen who understood the delicate balance between efficiency and gentleness. The sound of mills working was one of the constant sounds of medieval life, the splashing of water wheels, the rumbling of stones, the voices of millers calling to their customers. William turns from the window, noticing that the mist has followed him into the chamber. It swirls gently around his ankles, cool and soft as silk, seeming almost alive in the lantern light. He has never seen mist behave this way, moving with such purpose, creating shapes that almost look like figures. Chapter 3. The Lady Isabel. As William watches, the mist begins to coalesce, taking on forms that seem almost human. A figure emerges, translucent and beautiful, a lady in medieval dress. She wears a gown of deep blue silk, the color of midnight skies, embroidered with silver threads that catch the lantern light. Her hair is arranged in the fashion of the 13th century, parted in the center and braided into coils that rest gracefully on either side of her face. A simple circlet of gold adorns her brow, set with sapphires that seem to hold the depth of summer seas. She moves with the grace of nobility, every gesture refined by years of careful training, every step a lesson in elegance. This is Lady Isabel de Montfort, who lived in these chambers 600 years ago, whose story has waited all this time to be told. William feels no fear, only wonder, as if he has been expecting this meeting all his life. "Good evening, William," she says, her voice soft as evening prayers, clear as chapel bells. Medieval ladies were trained in the art of conversation, their voices modulated to carry exactly the right tone, never too loud, never too harsh, always musical. They learned to speak in cadences that pleased the ear, to choose words that elevated rather than diminished, to turn even simple observations into gentle poetry. "My lady," William replies, somehow knowing the proper response, bowing with the courtesy due to noble rank. Medieval manners were elaborate rituals, ways of showing respect that acknowledged the divine order of society, gestures that transformed daily interactions into ceremonials. Bowing was an art form, the depth of the bow precisely calculated according to the relative ranks of the participants, the duration exactly appropriate to the occasion. Ladies curtsied with equal precision, their movements flowing like dance, their heavy skirts managed with practiced skill. Even children learned these courtesies from their earliest years, understanding that proper behavior was a way of honoring both God and neighbor. "I have been waiting," Lady Isabel says, settling gracefully onto the stone window seat, "for someone who would listen, who would understand." Medieval women were often powerless in the larger world, but within their own domains they wielded significant influence, managing vast households, overseeing education of children, maintaining the cultural traditions that held society together. They were keepers of memory, preservers of family history, teachers of values that shaped the next generation. Lady Isabel arranges her skirts with unconscious elegance, every movement speaking of years of training in deportment and grace. Medieval ladies' education included far more than reading and writing. Though those skills were precious and not universal, they learned household management, how to direct servants without being harsh, how to plan meals that impressed guests while staying within budgets. They studied herbal medicine, Knowing which plants could cure fevers, which could ease childbirth, which could preserve food through long winters, music was considered essential. They played harps and lutes, sang both sacred and secular songs, composed verses that expressed their own thoughts and feelings. Dancing was both recreation and education, a way of learning grace and coordination, of displaying cultural refinement, of participating in the social rituals that bonded communities. Needlework was both practical skill and artistic expression, creating clothing that was both beautiful and functional, tapestries that told stories, altar cloths that honored the divine. Tell me your story, William says, settling into a comfortable position, his lantern placed where it will cast gentle light without creating harsh shadows. Medieval storytelling was a sacred art, a way of preserving wisdom, of sharing experiences that might otherwise be lost, of connecting past and present through shared narrative. Stories were told by the fireside on long winter evenings, passed from grandmother to grandchild, carried by traveling minstrels from castle to castle. They were both entertainment and education, teaching proper behavior through examples, preserving history through memorable characters, exploring moral questions through imagined situations. The best stories were like jewels, polished by countless tellings, their language refined, their meanings deepened by each generation that heard them. I was born in the year of our Lord 1223. Lady Isabel begins. In the castle of Montfort in Normandy, when the apple trees were heavy with fruit and the harvest promised to be abundant. Medieval births were times of great celebration and great danger. Infant mortality was high, but those children who survived were treasured beyond measure. Noblewomen were attended by skilled midwives, women who had learned their craft through years of experience, who knew which herbs could ease labor pains, which prayers could protect mother and child. The birthing chamber was prepared with special care, blessed by priests, furnished with the finest linens, warmed by carefully tended fires. Female relatives gathered to provide support, sharing their own experiences, offering comfort and encouragement, celebrating the safe arrival of each new life. Medieval astrology played a role in birth timing. The position of stars and planets consulted to determine the most favorable times for delivery. Naming was a serious matter. Children often named for saints whose protection was sought, or for ancestors whose virtues were hoped to be inherited. Baptism followed quickly after birth, ensuring that if the child should die, their soul would be safe in heaven, their brief life sanctified by the sacrament. My father was Robert de Montfort, Lady Isabel continues, a knight who served King Henry faithfully, who built our castle with stones that sang when the wind passed through them. Medieval knights were more than warriors. They were landowners, administrators, patrons of arts and learning, keepers of the peace in their territories. The code of chivalry governed their behavior, requiring courage in battle, courtesy to all, special protection for women and children, devotion to the church. Castle building was both art and science, requiring knowledge of engineering, understanding of defensive strategies, appreciation for beauty that would inspire and comfort those who lived within the walls. Master builders traveled from project to project, carrying their knowledge of architecture, Their understanding of how stones could be fitted together to create structures that would last for centuries. The stones themselves were chosen with care, local materials preferred when possible, but special stones brought from distant quarries when their qualities were superior. Limestone was favored for its workability, its ability to be carved into intricate decorations, its tendency to weather to beautiful colors. Sandstone was valued for its durability, its resistance to frost and rain, its warm colors that created inviting living spaces. Marble was reserved for special purposes, altars and tomb monuments, decorative columns that displayed wealth and refinement. My mother was Eleanor of Aquitaine's cousin, Lady Isabel says, a lady renowned for her learning, her skill with languages, her ability to compose verses that made grown knights weep. Medieval noblewomen often had remarkable educations, especially those connected to the great courts. Where learning was valued and patronized, they read Latin as well as their native tongues, studied classical literature, wrote poetry and letters that displayed both intelligence and refinement. Eleanor of Aquitaine herself was one of the most educated women of her time, patron of troubadours, promoter of courtly literature, ruler in her own right of vast territories. The courts of love that developed in the south of France created new ideals of romantic behavior, where women were revered as inspirations for noble deeds, where love itself was considered a refining force. These ideals spread throughout medieval Europe, influencing literature, shaping social customs, creating expectations for behavior between men and women that persist to this day. Medieval marriage among the nobility was usually arranged, but this did not mean that love was absent. Rather that love was expected to grow from mutual respect and shared values. Courtship rituals developed that allowed young people to express their feelings within acceptable bounds. Tournaments where knights could display their prowess, gift-giving that conveyed messages, poetry that elevated ordinary emotions into art. I was betrothed at 7, Lady Isabel says, her voice carrying neither bitterness nor regret, simply the acceptance of one who lived in times when such arrangements were normal. Medieval childhood ended early among the nobility. Children were expected to begin learning adult responsibilities as soon as they could understand them. Boys were sent to other castles as pages, learning the arts of war and courtesy, developing skills that would serve them throughout their lives. Girls remained closer to home, but their education was equally serious, preparing them for the complex responsibilities of running great households, managing estates, representing their families with dignity and grace. At T7, a noble child had already learned basic reading and writing, the fundamentals of arithmetic needed for household management, the rudiments of music and dance. They spoke at least 2 languages, their native tongue and Latin, often French as well if they were English, or English if they were French. Religious education was constant and thorough, not just the memorization of prayers, but understanding of theological principles, appreciation for the spiritual life that was considered the foundation of all earthly existence. My betrothed was Sir Edmund of Elmer, she continues, heir to these very stones, a young man of 18 when I first met him, tall and graceful as a young oak tree. Medieval betrothals were serious legal contracts, binding the families as well as the individuals. creating alliances that could affect the politics of entire regions. The ceremony of betrothal was as formal as marriage itself, conducted in the presence of witnesses, blessed by priests, sealed with rings and public vows. Young people were allowed to meet their intended spouses, to spend time together under proper supervision, to develop familiarity if not always affection. In the best cases, mutual liking grew into genuine love, marriages that began as political arrangements becoming partnerships of real affection and respect. Medieval concepts of love were complex, including not just romantic passion but also the deeper bonds of loyalty, mutual service, shared commitment to family and community. The literature of the time celebrated all forms of love, from the mystical devotion of saints to divine love, to the passionate but disciplined love of courtly romance, to the steady affection of married couples growing old together. Edmund was learned beyond his years. Lady Isabel says, her form becoming more solid as she speaks, as if the telling of her story gives her substance. He spoke Latin like a scholar, read Greek philosophy, wrote verses that compared the movement of stars to the rhythm of his beloved's heartbeat. Medieval education for young noblemen was comprehensive, including not just military training but also intellectual development, artistic appreciation, moral formation. They studied the 7 liberal arts: grammar, logic, rhetoric, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, music, subjects that were considered essential for understanding both earthly and heavenly realities. Classical literature was highly valued. Works of Virgil and Ovid, Cicero and Seneca, providing models of eloquent expression, examples of noble behavior, insights into human nature. Medieval scholars preserved much of classical learning, copying manuscripts by hand, translating important works, adding their own commentaries and insights. Monasteries were centers of learning, their libraries treasure houses of accumulated wisdom, their scriptoriums workshops where beautiful books were created. Medieval books were works of art, illuminated with gold leaf and brilliant colors,